Marissa Johnson moved methodically through the property, her trained eye catching every detail as she ensured everything was in place before closing for the night. The soft glow of lights reflected off the pool's still surface, casting a serene shimmer across the estate she had built from the ground up. Every inch of it, every stone, every perfectly manicured plant, stood as a testament to the years of sacrifice, the battles fought, the doors that had been slammed in her face before she forced them open. She had done this. A black woman in an industry where people like her were rarely seen at the top. She had defied expectations, shattered assumptions, and created a space where elegance met excellence. But no amount of success could erase the invisible lines drawn by those who believed power, wealth, and ownership belonged to a select few. She felt it before she heard it, that shift in the air, that presence that didn't belong to the piece of her estate. The sound of deliberate footsteps made her pause. She turned and met the cold, scrutinizing stare of a man standing just beyond the pool gate, his posture rigid with the confidence of someone who believed he had the right to question her existence. His narrowed eyes traveled over her, calculating, judging, searching for something to validate whatever assumption had already taken root in his mind. "Who are you?" His voice was sharp, intrusive, already laced with suspicion. Marissa didn't flinch. She had dealt with men like him before, men who looked at her skin and saw an employee at best, an intruder at worst. Her expression remained composed as she met his gaze. "I own this property." The words were simple, factual, undeniable. Yet his face twisted in disbelief, his lips pulling into a scoff that barely concealed the smirk of someone who had already decided she was lying. "Is that so?" His eyes flicked over the pristine surroundings, as if searching for a flaw in her claim. "Because I know the owner, and I don't think she'd be too happy about some stranger locking up her place." Marissa inhaled slowly, keeping her voice calm, steady. "I am the owner, Marissa Johnson. This estate has been mine since 2014. The air between them grew heavier, thick with unspoken accusations. He shifted his stance, tilting his head as if sizing her up, waiting for her to break under his gaze. But she didn't. Instead, she watched as his fingers tightened around the phone in his hand, the flicker of a decision crossing his face. She had seen this before. The moment when doubt twisted into entitlement, when the refusal to accept truth turned into the need to summon authority. "You need to leave," he said, his tone flat, final. "I'm calling the police." Marissa's jaw clenched, but she remained still, watching as he pressed the call button without hesitation. The one-sided conversation played out exactly as she expected, his voice calm yet urgent, every word carefully selected to frame the situation just right. "Yes, I need officers at the Silver Lake estate," he said, his eyes never leaving hers. "There's a trespasser. She's locking things up like she owns the place." The pause, the shift in his tone, the slight emphasis on she, it was all so predictable, so practiced, a script played out time and time again. Marissa exhaled slowly. She could have left. She could have avoided the confrontation, spared herself the hassle, but why should she? Why should she move when she was exactly where she belonged? The distant sound of sirens confirmed what she already knew. This wasn't about clarification. It was about control. The man took a step back, arms crossed, satisfied with his decision, convinced that soon enough, someone else would come and handle this for him. Marissa didn't move. She didn't waver. The red and blue lights flashed against the elegant facade of the estate, illuminating the tension that had settled thick in the air. 2 patrol cars rolled onto the property, and from them emerged 2 officers, their presence commanding, their expressions unreadable. The man straightened, nodding toward them, his confidence solidified now that the reinforcement had arrived. One officer, tall and sharp-featured, approached first, his gaze landing on Marissa without hesitation. "Ma'am, do you live here?" The words carried weight, and yet they were the same ones she had heard before, spoken in the same neutral yet pointed tone. Marissa held his stare, unshaken. "I own this property." She reached into her pocket, moving deliberately, aware of how even the smallest motion could be misinterpreted. The officer watched as she retrieved her ID, her grip firm, her posture unyielding. She extended it to him without a word. He took it, his eyes flicking between her face and the name printed on the card. Behind him, the other officer, stockier and less composed, shifted his attention to the man who had called. "Sir, what's your relation to this property?" The man faltered, caught off guard by the direct question. "I live nearby," he finally answered, clearing his throat. "I've seen the owner before and she's not." He stopped himself just short of saying it outright. The officer's gaze lingered for a moment before turning back to the ID in his partner's hands. "Miss Johnson," the taller officer said, his tone measured, cautious. "Do you have any additional proof of ownership?" Marissa's lips pressed into a thin line. Proof. As if her presence here, her ID, her name, her word weren't enough. She knew better than to argue. Instead, she nodded toward the main house. "Inside my office. I can get the property documents." The officer hesitated before nodding, motioning for her to lead the way. But even as she moved, she could feel the weight of the man's gaze still on her, the simmering resentment of someone who had expected a different outcome. And even as the officers followed her inside, she knew this wasn't over. The video spreads faster than Marissa could have anticipated, shared and reshared across social media, collecting thousands of views within hours. Guests at the hotel had recorded everything. The arrival of the police, the way the officers had questioned her first, the moment she had to prove she owned the very property she had built. The footage was clear, but the reactions were anything but. Comments exploded in every direction. Some people were outraged, calling it another example of how Black success was always questioned, how ownership was never enough, how the goalposts kept moving no matter how many times they proved their worth. Others scrambled to justify what happened, defending the man who had called the police, insisting he was just being cautious, that he couldn't have known. They turned it into a debate, as if what had happened wasn't obvious, as if it wasn't exactly what it looked like. Marissa scrolled through the responses, feeling the familiar exhaustion settle deep in her bones. She knew how these things played out. The cycle was predictable: outrage, arguments, distractions, and then, eventually, silence. But this time, silence wasn't an option. By the next morning, local news stations were calling. Reporters showed up at the estate, cameras in hand, microphones poised, eager to capture her side of the story. Marissa had never wanted to be a spectacle, had never planned on becoming a headline, but here she was. She agreed to the interviews, but the moment the questions started, she recognized the subtle tilt of the narrative. "Do you think this was a misunderstanding?" one journalist asked, as if there was any room for doubt. "Are you concerned this might negatively impact your business?" Another probed, as if she should be the one worried about consequences. Some reports framed her as a victim, others as a question mark, leaving room for doubt, for alternative interpretations, for the suggestion that maybe, just maybe, she hadn't belonged there after all. And then came the scrutiny, not just of the incident, but of her. Her success. Her credentials. Her right to own what she did. The police department issued a carefully worded statement, neither admitting fault nor offering apology. They called it a routine response to a citizen's concerns. They assured the public that proper procedures were followed. But behind closed doors, an internal review had begun. Marissa knew that meant nothing. It was damage control, a way to make the situation go away quietly. They weren't interested in justice. They were interested in optics. But she wasn't interested in being anyone's lesson in public relations. She had spent her life fighting for what she had, and she wasn't about to let someone else define this moment for her. She sat in her office, staring at the flood of emails, messages, and missed calls. She could let this pass. She could step back, focus on her business, and wait for the next viral incident to replace hers in the public eye. But that wasn't who she was. This wasn't just about her. It was about the fact that no matter how much she had achieved, no matter how many years she had built this place, one man's doubt had been enough to summon the police to her doorstep. It was about every other Black business owner who had been questioned, challenged, dismissed. If she let this go, she would be letting them win. Still, the risks were real. She had worked too hard to watch her hotel be swallowed by controversy. Investors were already asking questions, subtly probing whether this kind of attention was good for business. Some of her wealthier guests had canceled their reservations, not wanting to be caught in the middle of a situation. The pressure was mounting, whispering that she should choose her battles carefully. But this wasn't just a battle. It was the war she had been fighting since the day she had signed the deed to this property. Then came the final blow. A rumor surfaced that George Clayton and his allies were preparing to file a formal petition challenging her ownership. It was absurd, offensive, a blatant attempt to force her to prove she belonged. They had no legal grounds, but they had influence, and influence could make life difficult. If the petition gained traction, it could mean audits, investigations, endless paperwork designed not to uncover the truth but to wear her down. They weren't trying to win, they were trying to make her quit. She pushed her chair back, planting her feet firmly on the floor. She had two choices. She could retreat, shrink herself to fit the expectations of people who had never wanted her here in the first place, or she could stand taller, fight harder, and remind them that she wasn't going anywhere. The decision wasn't hard. She reached for her phone, her fingers steady, her voice clear. It's time to talk. The rumors started quietly at first, whispered in the corners of the local cafes and behind closed doors, but soon they spread like wildfire, taking on a life of their own. Anonymous flyers began appearing around the city, tucked under windshield wipers, pinned to bulletin boards, and slipped into mailboxes. The words were blunt and accusatory. Marissa Johnson has illegally taken control of Silver Lake Estate. Her business is a fraud. They were simple enough, but the message was clear. She didn't belong, and she wasn't welcome. The town that once had embraced her success, the place she had worked so hard to make her own, now turned its back on her. People stopped coming to her hotel, and those who had once been regular guests canceled their stays, citing vague concerns about the situation. She felt the shift in the air, the way the streets seemed colder, the way strangers looked at her with just a little more suspicion than before. Local businesses began to quietly distance themselves, refusing to work with her, afraid that being associated with her would hurt their own reputations. It wasn't just a campaign against her business, it was an open attempt to erase her from the community. They wanted her to feel unwelcome, to know she had overstepped, to make it clear that no matter how hard she had fought to build her empire, some people would never accept a black woman at the top. Marissa quickly realized that this wasn't just a few disgruntled locals, it was coordinated. She dug deeper, and it didn't take long to uncover the truth. A group of wealthy, influential white real estate owners, the very people who had always controlled the area, were behind the campaign. They had never wanted her there, resented the success she had achieved, and saw her as a threat to their own hold on power. They didn't want a black woman owning property that had once belonged to their families, and they would stop at nothing to tear her down. The threats escalated. It started with anonymous calls, threats of violence, of accidents that would destroy her reputation, her business. Then came the vandalism. Her carefully tended property, the pride of her heart, was defaced with racial slurs, the windows of her office smashed. She could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of it pushing her into a corner. It was as if the world was closing in on her, the forces of hatred and fear conspiring to bring her down. But just as she was starting to wonder if she could hold on, help arrived from an unexpected place. Young activists, many of whom had followed her rise from the beginning, reached out to her. They were the ones who had rallied for social justice, for change, and they saw what was happening to her as part of the larger battle. They wanted to help, to fight back. Among them was her old friend, Jamal, a lawyer who had always supported her cause and who had worked on many of her legal contracts. He and his team started their own investigation, and they uncovered disturbing facts about George Clayton and the group of wealthy landowners who were behind the smear campaign. They had been manipulating the law, using their influence to exploit legal loopholes and drive her out of the property she had fought so hard to secure. This was bigger than just a personal vendetta. It was a coordinated effort to maintain control, to keep people like Marissa from succeeding. Jamal and his team dug through records, spoke to insiders, and uncovered a pattern of corruption, all aimed at discrediting her. Armed with this new information, Marissa knew she had to fight back not just in the court of public opinion, but in the courts themselves. She couldn't let them destroy everything she had worked for. She took to social media, exposing the lies and the manipulations of George and his allies. She began to gather the evidence, the facts, and the truth, and she prepared for the legal battle that was about to unfold. She wasn't going to sit back and let them steal her future. They wanted her to be quiet, to go away, but Marissa wasn't going anywhere. As expected, George and his supporters filed a lawsuit, demanding that the legitimacy of her ownership be reviewed, questioning her every move, trying to force her to prove her worth again. But Marissa was ready. This wasn't just about her property, it was about a system that had always worked to suppress those who dared to rise above their station, and Marissa wasn't about to let it win. She wasn't just fighting for a hotel. She was fighting for everything it stood for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. And she would fight until the end. Jamal stood before the flashing cameras, his voice calm but unwavering as he revealed the truth behind the smear campaign orchestrated by George Clayton and his allies. He laid out the evidence, piece by piece, dissecting the racist motivations that had driven George to call the police on Marissa in the first place. The press conference was a turning point, a clear attempt to take control of the narrative, to shift the conversation from accusations to facts. Jamal didn't pull any punches. He spoke of how George and his wealthy real estate cohort had been systematically undermining Marissa for years, unable to accept the idea of a black woman succeeding in a space that had always been theirs by unspoken rule. But as the truth was laid bare for the world to see, the backlash came quickly. Those who had always held the power, those who had silently supported George's actions, moved swiftly to discredit Marissa and Jamal. New rumors began to circulate, fueled by anonymous sources, claiming that Marissa had hidden past business dealings, that she had somehow obtained the estate under questionable circumstances. The stories were vague but damning, and they spread like wildfire through the media, casting doubt on everything Marissa had worked for. It wasn't enough to tear down her reputation, they had to create a narrative so strong that it couldn't be ignored. Marissa knew that the weight of these lies, however false, was enough to shake the foundation she had spent years building. The strain began to show. Suppliers, who had once eagerly sought contracts with the estate, now began to pull back. The pressure from influential figures in the city who had quietly sided with George was too much for them to ignore. Contracts were canceled, deals fell through, and the business that had been thriving just weeks before now faced a future shrouded in uncertainty. With each lost contract, Marissa felt her control slipping, like sand through her fingers, but she refused to let it break her. She began searching for alternative financing, reaching out to investors who weren't afraid to stand by her side, who understood that supporting her meant supporting a future where such discrimination wouldn't go unchallenged. But every call she made, every meeting she attended, was met with resistance. The fear in people's eyes was palpable. They didn't want to be involved in a fight that could cost them their own standing. Even some of her closest allies began to waver. One such ally, a longtime friend who worked in the city's administration, sent a message that hit Marissa like a punch to the gut. He wouldn't be able to support her. The pressure had gotten to him, and he feared the consequences of standing by her. He feared losing his position, his career, the very future he had worked to build. Marissa had never expected it to come from him, and yet, here it was. Another reminder that in times of crisis, even the most trusted allies could be swayed by the forces at play. Her stomach churned, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't afford to let this betrayal pull her under. As the pressure mounted, some of her own staff began to feel the heat. One by one, employees who had been with her for years began to hand in their resignations. They were afraid. Afraid of the scrutiny, afraid of the potential violence, afraid of being caught in the crossfire. The feeling of abandonment was like a cold wave crashing over her, but she couldn't let it drown her. She had no time for self-pity, no time to feel sorry for herself. The stakes were too high. Then, just when it seemed like everything was falling apart, a package arrived at her office. It was small, unmarked, and there was no return address. Inside, she found a set of documents, carefully organized, revealing a pattern of deceit. They were records from a previous property dispute, records showing that George and his allies had tried to illegally seize land from another business owner years before. The papers outlined fraudulent tactics, attempts to intimidate and drive competitors out, and a clear record of manipulation. The revelation hit her like a thunderclap. She had the evidence she needed, The smoking gun that proved George's tactics were not just personal, they were systematic. This was the turning point she had been waiting for. She wasn't just going to fight back with words. She was going to expose the truth. With Jamal's help, she began preparing the evidence for court, knowing that once it was out in the open, the lies they had built would crumble. The time for waiting was over. The time for retaliation had come. Marissa was ready to take her fight to the next level, to show the world not just who George Clayton was, but what he had been trying to get away with all along. This wasn't just about saving her hotel. This was about dismantling the system that had allowed people like George to operate unchecked for so long. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with the kind of anticipation that only comes when everything is on the line. Marissa sat at the defendant's table, her gaze unwavering as George Clayton, now dressed in a suit that seemed too tight for his inflated sense of importance, took the stand. His voice, though steady, carried the subtle tremor of someone trying to manipulate the situation to their advantage. "I just wanted to get to the bottom of things," he claimed, his eyes darting toward the judge, pleading for sympathy. "I didn't know who she was. I had to call the authorities to make sure everything was above board. I wasn't accusing her, I was just trying to protect the community." The words fell from his lips like a carefully constructed performance. A man who had seen himself as a hero, when in reality he was the villain. Marissa clenched her jaw but remained silent, letting him spin his story. She knew how these people worked, the subtle manipulation of facts, the ability to twist the truth to fit their narrative. But the tide was about to turn. As George droned on, one of his former employees, a man who had worked for him for over a decade, stood up from the back of the room. The shock was palpable, the room falling into stunned silence as the man made his way to the witness stand. He was shaking, but his resolve was clear. He had seen too much, been complicit for too long, but now, faced with the opportunity to right a wrong, he stepped forward. "I can't stay silent anymore," he said, his voice quiet but full of conviction. "I worked for George for years, and I know what he's capable of. He's been trying to take other people's property for years." Marissa wasn't the first one he targeted. The revelation hit like a bombshell, the room erupting in murmurs as the former employee described how George had used fraudulent methods to acquire properties that didn't belong to him. He detailed how George had used threats, lies, and manipulations to force owners out of their homes and businesses, all to expand his empire. Marissa's team was quick to pounce on the opening, presenting the documents they had uncovered, each piece of evidence a nail in George's coffin. The papers painted a clear picture. George Clayton had been using every dirty trick in the book, from falsifying deeds to bribing city officials, all to take control of land that wasn't his. The lies, the manipulations, the decades of deceit, they all came to light in front of the judge and the jury, and with each passing moment, George's facade began to crumble. The judge, a woman known for her fairness but also for her no-nonsense approach, listened carefully to the evidence. After what felt like an eternity, she delivered her ruling. "The evidence is clear. Marissa Johnson has proven her rightful ownership of Silver Lake Estate, and George Clayton's actions have been deemed unlawful." The room went silent, the weight of the moment settling in as Marissa allowed herself the smallest of smiles. The victory was hers, and with it, the validation of everything she had fought for. George sat there, stunned, his mouth agape as the reality of his loss began to sink in. His supporters, who had once rallied behind him, began to slowly distance themselves, their eyes shifting uncomfortably as they realized they had been backing the wrong side all along. They had supported a man who had lied, who had tried to tear down a woman who had built something from nothing. Now, they had to live with the consequences of their actions. The whispers started almost immediately, the tide of support for George turning to cold indifference as people began to see the truth. The man who had once been the face of local power and influence was now left alone, his empire of deceit crumbling around him. But even as Marissa sat there, her heart pounding with the satisfaction of victory, she knew that this wasn't the end. This courtroom battle was only the first step in a much longer journey. She had won the legal fight, but the bigger battle, one for equity, for justice, for the right to be seen as equal, was far from over. The victory in the courtroom had done nothing to erase the fact that people like George would always exist, that the system that had allowed him to flourish had not been dismantled in a single ruling. Marissa understood that the work was just beginning. The fight for justice wasn't something that ended with a court decision. It was something that had to be fought for every day, in every room, in every conversation. And though she had won today, she knew that there were more battles to come. This was just the beginning of the long road toward change, a road that she was determined to walk down, no matter what it took. The victory in the courtroom had been a hard-earned triumph, but Marissa knew the real work was only just beginning. She couldn't afford to rest, not when everything she had built hung in the balance. As soon as the verdict was delivered, she moved swiftly to restore her reputation, reaching out to former clients and business partners who had pulled away during the scandal. She reassured them, showing them the truth behind the smear campaign, and slowly but surely, the tide began to turn. Bookings picked up again, the steady stream of guests returning to her estate, the whispers of doubt fading into the background. Her business began to thrive once more, and with it, her confidence. Yet even as things began to settle, new opportunities came knocking at her door. A prominent organization reached out to her with an unexpected offer. They wanted her to lead an educational program on racial prejudice and discrimination in business, a chance to speak out and use her experiences to make a real impact. It was a challenge, but it was one she was ready for. She had lived the lessons she would teach. She knew exactly how it felt to be doubted, to be pushed aside simply because of the color of her skin, and she would use her voice to ensure that others wouldn't have to go through the same struggles. But even as she accepted the invitation to speak, a sense of unease settled deep within her. George Clayton had retreated from the public eye, his influence waning, but Marissa couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike again. She had seen how quickly things could change, how fragile the balance of power was, and she knew he wouldn't just disappear. He would be back. It was just a matter of when. Days passed, and the unsettling feeling didn't subside. Marissa began to notice things she hadn't before: cars parked too close to the estate, people she didn't recognize walking around the property. It was subtle at first, just small things, but the pattern became undeniable. She wasn't just imagining it. Someone was watching her, keeping track of her every move. The anonymous calls started coming in, at odd hours of the day and night. The voices on the other end were always muffled, their words cryptic, but the message was clear: they were still watching. It wasn't just her business at stake anymore. It was her safety, her sense of security. She tried to shake off the paranoia, telling herself that she was just being cautious, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at her every time she stepped outside, every time she glanced over her shoulder. Her mother, who had always been a source of strength, became worried. The toll the fight had taken on Marissa was evident, and her mother, in her soft-spoken way, pleaded with her to step away. "You've already proven your point, baby," her mother said one evening, her voice trembling with concern. "Please, just let it go. It's not worth it. You've got so much ahead of you." But Marissa couldn't walk away. Not when she had come so far. Not when she knew that every victory, every piece of progress, was fragile, and that the system that had tried to break her down still existed, still had its claws in the city, in the people who held the power. She couldn't stop now. But as the days passed, the pressure built, and she wondered just how long she could keep fighting. Then, one afternoon, a package arrived at the hotel's office. It was a small envelope, unmarked, with no return address. Inside, Marissa found a set of documents, the kind that sent a chill down her spine. They were copies of emails, official letters, and legal documents that clearly showed George's ties to high-ranking city officials, evidence of his influence within local government, the very people who had quietly supported his actions behind the scenes. The implications were staggering. George had been using his connections to protect himself, to ensure that his schemes would never be exposed. But now, with this evidence in her hands, Marissa had the ammunition she needed to strike back, not just at George, but at the entire system that had allowed him to operate with impunity. It was a new chapter in the battle, one that would change everything. She wasn't just fighting for her hotel anymore. She was fighting for the truth. And with the documents in her hands, she knew it was time to turn the tide once again. The fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. Marissa stood at the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon as the weight of the situation pressed down on her, heavier than it ever had before. She had thought this was about her, about protecting her hotel, about reclaiming what was hers. But as the layers of the case unraveled, it became clear that this wasn't just a personal conflict. This was a much larger fight, one that touched every corner of the system she had once believed in. This wasn't just about George Clayton's vendetta against her. It was about a corrupt network of people who had been playing this game for decades, manipulating the system to line their pockets, using their power to control land and businesses, to crush anyone who dared to stand in their way. As the realization sank in, Marissa's resolve hardened. She had to fight not just for herself, but for everyone who had been crushed by the same system. The fight was no longer hers alone. It was a battle for justice. It was a battle for everything that was right. But the battle wasn't just going to be won in the courts. It was going to take everything she had. Just as she was considering her next move, a message arrived that changed everything. The source was anonymous, and yet the information they provided was too detailed, too precise to ignore. A tip-off, an insider who claimed to have the information that could bring George and his allies down. The tipster revealed that George had been involved in a series of illegal financial transactions, funneling money through shell companies, laundering funds from shady deals that went back years. This wasn't just about real estate, it was about money laundering, tax evasion, and possibly even organized crime. Marissa's heart raced as she processed the information. She knew she couldn't take this on alone, not anymore. It was time to escalate. She contacted the federal authorities, knowing this was far beyond the scope of local law enforcement. They needed to take over. They needed to investigate, to dig deeper, to expose the full extent of the corruption that had allowed George to operate with impunity for so long. Marissa wasn't just a victim now, she was part of something much bigger. The wheels of justice began to turn, and soon the financial machinations that George had been hiding for years started to come to light. Shell companies, fake documents, offshore accounts, all of it connected back to George and his network of wealthy supporters. The weight of the evidence against him was undeniable. But just as Marissa thought the walls were closing in, something unexpected happened. George disappeared. He vanished without a trace, leaving behind the wreckage of his empire, his carefully constructed facade crumbling in the face of the truth. It didn't take long for the federal authorities to realize that he had fled the country, likely to some place where he couldn't be touched, where his connections could protect him. Marissa was left standing in the wreckage, knowing that the fight had just shifted to a new level. George was gone, but his allies were still out there, and now Marissa had to face the truth. This was a fight that would take years, if it was even winnable. The new battle wasn't just in the courts or the media, it was in the shadows, where the real power lay. The deeper Marissa dug, the more dangerous the game became. Just as she thought she had a handle on the situation, a letter arrived. It was a simple envelope, no return address, no markings. Inside, there was only a single line of text: "Stop now or else." The threat was clear, and the cold chill that ran down Marissa's spine told her that this wasn't just some empty threat. Someone out there wanted her to back down, to shut up, to leave everything she had fought for behind. But Marissa wasn't about to let them silence her. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to back down now. She didn't know who was behind the threat, but she knew this fight wasn't over. She had to keep pushing, keep exposing the truth. No matter what it took. The fire started in the dead of night. Marissa had been home, finally giving herself a rare moment of respite, when the sound of sirens pierced the quiet of her house. Her heart skipped a beat as she rushed to the window, watching the flickering red lights dance across the sky, only to realize with horror that the fire was coming from one of the cottages at her estate. The flames leapt high into the air, their hungry reach licking at the night, threatening to destroy everything she had fought for. Her mind raced, her stomach twisted in knots as she rushed out the door, her feet barely touching the ground as she sprinted toward the property. The fire trucks had arrived, but the damage was already done. One of the cottages had been completely gutted. As she stood there, watching the smoke curl into the sky, a sickening realization settled in her chest. This was no accident. This was a warning. Someone was trying to send her a message. Someone wanted to silence her. The next day, a call came in. The voice on the other end was calm, too calm, as if the person had rehearsed what they were about to say. They offered her a deal, a large sum of money in exchange for walking away from the fight, for dropping the case, for letting George Clayton's actions go unpunished. The amount they offered was staggering, enough to secure her future, to rebuild everything she had worked for, but it came at a cost, a price she couldn't bring herself to pay. Marissa's hand trembled slightly as she held the phone, listening to the person's words, trying to understand why they thought she would just walk away. The offer wasn't about money, it was about power, about forcing her to accept that some people were above the law, that her fight didn't matter. They thought they could by her silence. But they were wrong. Marissa wasn't for sale. She had lost everything, friends, allies, security, but she wasn't about to lose her soul. As the pressure mounted, Marissa's fears for her family began to grow. She had always known the risks, but now they were real, tangible. The anonymous threats, the fire, the menacing whispers, they weren't just directed at her. They were a message for anyone who dared to stand with her. She received a call from her mother that night, her voice shaking with fear as she asked Marissa to stop, to let go, to leave the fight before it was too late. "I can't lose you," her mother had said, the words laced with a vulnerability that Marissa had never heard before. It was the first time her mother had ever begged her, and it cut deeper than any threat or insult could. Marissa understood her mother's fear, but she couldn't stop. Not now, not when she had already come so far. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, every person who had ever been silenced, every person who had ever been forced to bow to the powerful and the corrupt. But the danger wasn't just physical. The FBI had started investigating George's financial dealings, and the scope of his crimes was starting to come to light. The money laundering, the bribes, the false documents, it was all part of the larger web of corruption that had kept him in power for so long. The investigation was just beginning, but Marissa knew it wouldn't be long before everything George had worked to protect came crashing down around him. It was a moment of hope, a fleeting sense that maybe justice was finally within reach. But with the hope came the realization that the battle was far from over. The stakes were higher than ever, and Marissa knew that the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things would become. She couldn't afford to wait any longer. The time for talking was over. It was time to act. Marissa decided to go public with everything she knew. She would stand in front of the world and expose the corruption, the lies, the conspiracy that had allowed George Clayton and his allies to operate unchecked for so long. She would tell her story, the whole truth, and let the world see what had been happening behind the scenes. The fear was still there, lurking in the back of her mind, but it was drowned out by the burning need for justice. She wasn't going to let them get away with it. She wasn't going to let them destroy everything she had worked for. The fight had only just begun. George Clayton returned to the city as suddenly as he had disappeared, his reappearance marked by a calculated calm that suggested he believed his absence had been a strategic retreat, a way to let the dust settle before he could rise again. He moved through the streets with a certain arrogance, as if the world owed him an apology for the inconvenience of having to go on the run, and now, with his return, he planned to reclaim his former standing. He quickly tried to turn the narrative in his favor, attempting to portray himself as the victim of a smear campaign, a man wronged by forces beyond his control. The media, always hungry for a story, devoured his every word, and soon enough, his narrative began to take hold. His voice echoed in the press, claiming that Marissa's actions had been driven by personal vendettas and that he had only been trying to protect the community from someone who didn't belong. He was the aggrieved party, the misunderstood businessman who had been unfairly attacked. It was a familiar play, one he had used before, but this time, the weight of the truth was too much for him to maneuver around. The evidence Marissa had collected, the damning documents that proved his financial misdeeds, the accounts that showed his web of deceit, these were irrefutable, and no amount of manipulation could erase the facts. The FBI had been tracking his every move, and once they put everything together, it was only a matter of time before he was cornered. The authorities arrested George, and the charges against him were as severe as they were numerous: fraud, money laundering, bribery, and conspiracy. The weight of his crimes was enough to bring down his empire, and he found himself, for the first time, on the other side of the law, powerless to manipulate his way out of the consequences. Marissa watched as the news broke, the images of George in handcuffs flashing across screens, and for a moment, she allowed herself to feel the rush of triumph. This was what she had fought for, what she had risked everything to expose. He had finally been held accountable, his lies unraveled, his manipulations brought to light. But as the weeks passed, the victory began to feel hollow. The cheers of her supporters were distant, and the satisfaction of her wins started to fade. There was no celebration, no sense of vindication, only the deep, gnawing feeling that the world she had fought to create was forever changed. She had won the battle, but in the process, she had lost something far more important. Trust. The trust of those who had stood by her side in the early days, only to see them drift away as the fight wore on. The trust of a community that had once welcomed her but now viewed her with suspicion, unsure if her success had been hard-earned or the result of manipulation. The truth had come out, but so had the darker side of human nature. People she had considered friends had abandoned her, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire of a battle that had gotten too big, too messy. The same people who had once cheered her on were now silent, and Marissa realized with a sinking feeling that she had become a symbol, not of triumph, but of division. In the midst of this personal turmoil, an unexpected offer came her way. A nonprofit organization reached out to her with a proposition to lead a national campaign against racial inequality in business, a chance to use her experiences to push for systemic change. It was a lifeline, an opportunity to turn the pain of the past months into something positive, to help others who were facing the same obstacles she had fought so hard to overcome. The decision wasn't easy. Marissa had been through so much, and part of her wanted to retreat, to leave everything behind and find peace somewhere far away from the fight. But she knew, deep down, that her work was far from over. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced, who had ever been told they didn't belong, who had ever been pushed aside by a system that wasn't built for them. It was time to take the next step, to turn the pain and the betrayal into something meaningful. Marissa accepted the offer, knowing that the work ahead would be challenging, but also knowing that it was the only way to find true purpose in the aftermath of everything she had endured. The courtroom victory, while monumental, had come at an immense cost, one Marissa could feel deep in her bones every time she woke up in the morning. It wasn't just the physical exhaustion from years of battling a corrupt system, it was the emotional toll, the isolation that had grown around her like a suffocating blanket. For every win she had secured, for every inch of progress she had made, she had lost something too: friends, allies, pieces of her own innocence. The victory had come with its own brand of emptiness, a lingering sense that, no matter how much she had achieved, the price had been too high. The city she had fought to build her place in no longer felt like home. The people who had once cheered her on had pulled back, hesitant to be associated with her in the wake of the scandal. Her phone rang less frequently, and her inbox was filled with unanswered messages from those who had once been so eager to work with her, now too frightened to make contact. They had seen what she had done, how she had fought back against a system that had always supported them, and they had retreated into the shadows, unwilling to stand beside her for fear of the consequences. But Marissa knew that the real change wasn't going to come from their approval. It was never going to be about the people who had turned away when things got hard. It was about the people she had inspired to stand up, to keep fighting even when the odds seemed insurmountable. She saw them in the emails, the messages of support that flooded in from people she had never met, from people who had followed her journey from afar and had found the courage to keep going because of it. They were the ones who mattered. They were the reason she had fought, the reason she had endured. They were proof that, despite everything, her battle had meant something. As the months passed and the scars from the battle began to heal, Marissa realized that her life would never be the same. It couldn't be. She had crossed a line, stepped into a fight that had irrevocably changed the way she saw the world. There was no going back to the life she had once imagined, no peaceful retreat into the background, no easy days of managing her business without the weight of the world on her shoulders. But in a strange way, that was okay. She had built something far more important than just a hotel. She had built a movement, a force that could no longer be ignored. Her name had become synonymous with justice, with resilience, with the fight against a broken system, and no matter what happened next, that could never be taken from her. The battle had left its mark, but it had also given her something she could never have imagined before, a voice. A voice that could speak not just for herself, but for all those who had been silenced, for all those who had fought and lost, for all those who were still fighting in the shadows. It wasn't the victory that had defined her, it was the fight itself. The victory had been a product of that fight, but the real triumph was in the courage it took to stand up, to speak out, to refuse to be silenced. Marissa understood now that the struggle would never truly end. It wasn't just about one man, one business, one corrupt system. It was about creating a new world, one where people like her didn't have to fight just to exist in spaces they had every right to occupy. It was about changing the system from the ground up, and that kind of change wasn't quick. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. And even though the road ahead was uncertain, Marissa knew she couldn't stop now. The fire that had driven her through the darkest moments was still burning. It would burn for as long as it took to see the change she believed in. And as long as that fire burned, her fight was far from over. She had proven that it wasn't just about winning. It was about never giving up, about standing tall in the face of adversity, about inspiring others to do the same. In the end, that was what mattered most.